Hi all. I'm here on Darragnura today. I'm normally joining you from Cubby Cubby land, but I'm down here near the campus today. I've got some images that I'm going to show as we start to talk about protest and its relationship to policy and its relationship to the complexity of being a LGBTIQA plus Indigenous person. So let me just share that screen for you. So I start with Yindamara Winangana, the idea of respectfully knowing how to live well in a world worth living in. This is an incredibly important way of understanding the world for Wiradjuri people. It does two things, and it's why I often come back to it when I think of the way that we resist policy, the way that we challenge policy, and the way that we use protest to do those things. And that's this idea of being respectful, but knowing how to live well in a world that's worth living in, a world that is made to include, that is made to understand and accommodate. So it's an action as well as a kind of passive note to live well in that world, but a very active idea of making the world better. It requires protest, actually. It requires protest of the colonial project specifically. So this is I'm giving you these photos for a reason. This is me in 1985. This was me at the time that I did the first protests that I did. And I'd certainly done protests in the 70s, but these were the first queer protests that I'd engaged with. And I saw this as an important part of my journey and my development, but I thought I'd give you a context for who I was at the time. I think we have to think about this. We have to think about the people that we were at the time that we engaged in this. And again, this is part of Yindamara Winangana, is to say that person, that much younger person, made a world, was part of making the world that we live in today, for good or bad. I want to alert you, and I've put in a series of links to these, to a number of pieces by Indigenous writers and thinkers around this space of protest. Now, the first few are very specifically talking about Mardi Gras. This is Dr. Lisa Marie Siren. This is actually, that's a picture of Novagina, also pronounced Novagina. And it's a challenge to say, it's one of the more recent articles this year, a challenge to say that Koori Gras, in this case, this idea of protest put into form, put into program, has been a part of the process of Mardi Gras for a few years, and it's become this site of action. There's a lot of criticism of Mardi Gras. When I, going back to the photo of me, 1985, 84 actually was the first year that I attended Mardi Gras. And at the time, it was all about protest, and so was I. But so was everyone. There was a lot of celebration of who we were, but there was also a lot of misunderstandings about the reason for the protests as well. And so there was a lot of education that was going on around it. In the midst of that, there was a lot of things that were happening for the Indigenous community more broadly. In particular, massive, massive protests that were leading up to 88. And at that time, there was a lot of desire to say Indigenous people are a monolith, one kind of person, to be understood. And at the same time, there'd been this massive set of protests that we'd all been engaged with. So before, I talked about this around this time being my first time engaged in protest. But of course, as I also mentioned, I'd been engaged in Indigenous protest for years. I grew up in Queensland, which meant that marching was illegal at the time. And so certainly it wasn't in that kind of form, though we broke ranks with that all the time. But coming down to Sydney, where I lived in the 80s, there was a lot of opportunity for being able to engage in that kind of protest. But it was very hard within the scope of that to have anything other than the monolith that was being represented. And that wasn't some internal community resistance at all. It, not that that didn't exist, but that wasn't really the function of it. It was really compelling single actions. At that time, land rights was a very crucial part of this process going up to a celebration of, you know, the broader colonial nation, and a reminder, a kind of reckoning of our relationship as Indigenous people to that space. So there wasn't the opportunities that existed later to do this radical work. But it's through processes like Koori Gras that Dr. Siren was very actively engaged in developing, that have reminded that this is still a space of protest. Now, there's been a lot of criticism about Mardi Gras over the years, that it's been commercialised, that it no longer represents protest and only represents celebration. I'm one of the people who criticises it on that basis, but I also engage with it because I truly believe that you cannot criticise something that you don't participate in. And the only way that you can do that adequately is to create a position in which you want to see that change happen. And so so this is the second page of Dr. Siren's work, and there's very much this idea of challenge found in this piece that was written for Indigenous X, by the way. I want to take you through the last few years of a few of these pieces that have focused a little on Mardi Gras. So this was by Daniel Browning, and it's also a reminder that Dan's work is often not about queerness, but Dan does write about queerness very eloquently, and has produced a number over 12, it's 12 that he'd done, 12 pieces for Away, which he hosted for many years. I think it might have been 18 years that he hosted it for. And over that time did 12 different pieces that you can access through the Away website. Yeah. So again, this idea of the disconnect between the act of celebration and the ongoing experience of being queer and Indigenous in this continent is played out here in this Away piece. This is a piece by me, and you will see that there's misgendering of me on here, from 2017, where I'd reflected on what it was to be participating in it 13 years earlier in '84, and some of the ways that that there had been growth in participation from Indigenous people over that time. I think I'll be blunt and say that there is an active resistance in some of this writing, but there's also a little bit too much hope that things were really shifting around. But part of the reason that I wrote this was that I felt that it was incredibly important to recognise that people were a part of, that our people, that Indigenous people were a part of the process all the way through, that we didn't just arrive at a particular point. We weren't always accepted, and that's also flagged in there, the resistances. And this active resistance within a site that's meant to focus on acceptance is a reminder that LGBTIQA+ people who are settlers and who engage in kind of active participation in the colony are also subject to the same pressures and can also enact racism in the same way as other people. Now, we know this is like almost the base point for the work that we've done in this unit, but there are these reminders that happen in action. And this is a piece by Ali Alizi that's a really interesting piece. Now, I'm just going to note that there's a dead naming that occurs. So I've put some notes on correcting that within the work. This is a piece from 2016. So part of this is saying it's not going to be the same process of challenge and protest that queer Indigenous people do as other people do. So this idea of non-Indigenous people coming into the space and bringing whatever their own cultural backgrounds into that idea of the complexity of protest is not going to work. So here's this notion of an anti-carceral approach that some Indigenous people will take the position on. There are some very fundamental anti-colonial reasons for that. But, you know, faced against the fact that there are police and the kind of resistances to that. In fact, if you see the most recent Heartbreak High, you'll see that there's a little bit of a discussion around the complexities of that. So there's a discussion then here as early as 2016 by Ali around this. I wanted to, you've got some readings this week that come from Bold, the book that's on stories of from older lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and intersex people. There's a number of stories through this that I think it's 9 stories that are Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander that are found throughout this book that has about 50 stories in it. There's a very large percentage because the writer was Dr. David Hardy, who was my brother, who died earlier this year. And so obviously we had an Aboriginal man, queer man writing this, and so was very felt that it was very important to be privileging the voices of Indigenous people throughout. You've got Ani Dawn Daylight, who is a remarkable musician and thought leader. There's a piece that she'd written. And then there's also here the Colouring the Rainbow book. Now, Colouring the Rainbow book is available online through the library. So all of the chapters are available in that way if you need to access any of them. I've got a piece in there. A number of this was really the first time. This is 2015. Sorry, I don't have the citation up there, but I'll put it up. 2015. This was the first time that there had been an edited volume of contributions, 30 or so contributions from Indigenous people from across this continent who were talking about what it was to be queer and Indigenous. And it's funny, some of the language in it, even though it's only 7 years old, is a little bit more old-fashioned. Also, you'll see me misgendering myself throughout it. So I do think this is an incredibly crucial text. I frequently reference Alison Whittaker's work in here that really brings to the fore this notion of survivance. So talks about the idea that, of course, we've always been here. So it's an important note to cite, but it's also just an incredible read from somebody who's a legal scholar. Bold, again, has, you know, very much first-person stories, but it also gives you a little bit of a sense of the, overarchingly, the book gives a sense of queer non-Indigenous ideas of what it is to be older, what it is to have lived through. You can probably see that on the front cover there. There's a picture of Mardi Gras, the '87 Mardi Gras, actually. that speaks to the fact that there were a number of people who were in the first Mardi Gras that saw this as protest, and there's an ongoing discussion around that. There's a discussion around the complexity of identity too that's found there, and one of the ways that we see the trailing off of complexity here is that they're talking about what it is to be older. So this notion of protest is one that we have to understand didn't just start with something like Mardi Gras. Again, we were all involved in protest. Protest has been an essential part of what it is to be Indigenous and challenge the colonial project and assert a place. It's changed policy. You know, if it wasn't for the day of mourning, you know, going back some 84 years, you wouldn't end up with the work that had happened to lead up to the 1967 referendum. You wouldn't have had the opportunity for those of us who are queer to actually be able to challenge a whole lot of the things around the system, to be able to assert our complexity of identity. You wouldn't have any of that without us also participating in that. So it's not all wrapped up with this idea of exerting queerness. You know, I don't necessarily wake up in the morning and go, wow, it's great to be a queer person. I don't necessarily wake up in the morning and go, it's great to be an Indigenous person, but obviously I am those things. And I think part of what we have to understand is that people are asserting the way that they are in the world, and that they're doing it in these multiple ways. But there are these events that bring us together and galvanize. And we saw it with Black Lives Matter protests here on this continent, where there was a massive push for recognizing the complexity of identity, recognizing that Black Lives Matter, all Black Lives Matter, you know, and that there was an understanding that some people were not getting that gift. And so there was a very large movement that asserted that Black trans lives matter, for instance, and that was very visible in protest. So when we talk about protest, we don't just talk about it in this really obvious way, like Mardi Gras or like getting out on the streets. We talk about it also through these processes. So I've included in the list a piece by Corinne Sullivan. And the work that Corinne does is also that act of protest. It's through writing, and it's around challenging these ways that people think of Indigenous people. It's around challenging the way that people contemplate queerness and Indigenous people. And it's about understanding that sex work is work, and that Indigenous queer people may be engaged in sex work. And it's about understanding that this kind of protest that asserts rights is incredibly important, however it happens. And one of the ways that we're able to understand it is to read through it. So reading these kinds of articles, reading that kind of academic work that that Corinne does, who's a Wiradjuri scholar, by the way, is incredibly important. And part of what Corinne has also started to write about is how much resistance there is to hearing this information, how much people want to contain the experience, how much others outside of those people that are actually being written about or participating in the writing feel that they need to contain what is Indigenous or even is queer. So that kind of resistance is a part of the colonial project of gender and everything else that I write about. And that many people are writing about as this active space to both create resistance and, I think more importantly, to suggest ways forward. So we often hear about this with something like land back. Land back is very clear. give land back. It's an action. It's an action out of policy. If you change policy, it's an action out of protest. It's an actionable work that you can do. And it's the same with so many of the ways that people are writing about this now and talking about this is to say, for queer Indigenous people, this is more than just about acceptance. Sure, at a base level, this is about acceptance, but it's about recognizing that we've got these very specific requirements. We've got these ways that we want to be able to move forward, and that in order for that to be understood, we need to be able to hear the complexity of voice. So I'll give you a practical example with that, because I realize it might sound a bit vague, but examples are found in the Bold book in this discussion of how to create, for older people, a safe place in aged care where you can be queer and Indigenous, and it's not seen as a one or the other, and neither are seen as problems. They're actually seen as the complexity of people. So to shift around something that could have compounding disadvantage that we would see through that lens of intersectionality to something that actually recognizes that complexity is something that can be celebrated. But in order to celebrate it, you have to understand it. And in order to understand it, you have to hear first person's voices. So the act of protest is about allies doing work, but it's mostly about the people doing the work, right? So I'll leave you with that, but there's a range more readings that are up in this last module. And the reason for that is that they may be parts of the journey that you'll take as you do your final essay. Thanks.